Well, the topic is courage on the front lines, and I want to dedicate tonight's talk to... Well, it looks like I've jammed that. Oh, there we go. Now if I can go back. There we go. I want to dedicate tonight's talk to the Anzacs. And I know we have the usual Australian-New Zealand rivalry, and it's all fun, and the jokes are funny, genuinely are so. But I really do love this country. I love the collaboration of our Antipodean neighbours. We're in a unique part of the world. We share so much. There's such a commonality between our nations, our sense of humour, what we value, because of the way that we were settled and the way that we have developed as nations. And of course, we were forged together in 1915 at Gallipoli. And I want to dedicate tonight's talk to people who really were courageous on the front line, including a relative of mine, my grandfather's half-brother, William Haswell Shelton, a private, just a young 22-year-old from a farming district at Mergen in southeast Queensland, which no one would have heard of. They'd only settled and developed the property 10 years prior, and he goes off to Gallipoli and is killed on the 25th of April. So I want to dedicate that to those courageous Anzacs. And I want to just say tonight too, that the grievances that we all share in this room about the things we've just seen on that incredibly powerful video, what our elites, what our politicians are doing to our children, the brainwashing, the harm, the mutilation, the things that we're going to hear about tomorrow from the incredible speakers that are here with us tonight. These grievances, I think, require the sort of response, and I need to be very careful about this. I'm not an advocate of violence. Please hear me carefully. I'm someone in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus of Nazareth, who rode into Jerusalem on a donkey to give his life up. It's the non-violent approach that I espouse. But nonetheless, something should rise up in us in the same way that something rose up in tens of thousands of young Kiwis and Aussies who went off to fight a war in distant Europe and the Dardanelles because the Kaiser and the Ottomans had taken a stand against civilization. The people we're fighting have taken a stand against civilization, and I think we have more reason than even my relative William Haswell Shelton to pick up the fight and to get into it. I really firmly believe that. Well, as Bob said, our office was bombed just after that Cape Town trip. It was a few days before Christmas. Marriage hadn't been redefined in Australia as yet, but our organisation was one of the only organisations, the Australian Christian Lobby, very similar to Family First. We were one of the only organisations in the country making a noise about this and trying to say we've got to preserve the definition of marriage for all the reasons that we know about, the justice for children, their right to the love of a mother and father, etc., and to ensure that we didn't end up in this slide of gender ideology. And that caused a lot of controversy. We had death threats, we had all sorts of vitriol in the media and the like. And then a few days before Christmas 2016, a man by the name of Jaden DeWong hired that van from Canberra Airport, put 6 20-kilogram gas bottles into it, and then drove it to our office, which was in an obscure sort of office precinct not far behind Parliament House in Canberra, and he detonated it about 9 o'clock at night. Now, he was trying to commit suicide. He managed to survive the blast. He walked 5 kilometres to the local hospital. Apparently you can do that with bad burns before they congeal, and he was put in an induced coma and airlifted to Sydney. But that was quite a dramatic event. We were on holidays. I got a phone call from my chief of staff to say there'd been an incident at the office. I travelled to Canberra the next day and saw this scene of devastation. The Australian Federal Police, they interviewed the assailant before he went into the induced coma. They took a video recording of it, and so they knew what he said, what his motivations were. But the very next day, Commander Walters of the Australian Federal Police gave a media conference, and he said this incident was not politically, religiously or ideologically motivated. Now, I don't know what it's like in New Zealand or the United States or other parts of the world, but those words are very important because they're the definitions of terrorism, religious, political or ideological. They were quick to say the very next day that that was not the motivation for this blast. Now, of course, the assailant was badly injured. It took him a long time to recover. He was eventually charged with arson. Did $100,000 worth of damage to our office, I have to say. And in the court case, of course, his name was then revealed, and that had been withheld from us. So some 3 or 4 months later, I got the name when I went to the ACT Magistrates Court. I went back to the office, Googled it, and found that he was a same-sex marriage activist who'd spent time in California working for Democrat politicians, working on the Proposition 8 campaign to try and redefine marriage in California. And he was not a neutral player. He was a political activist. And then a few months later, when he went to court again, the media were able to get from the court documents a transcript of the interview that he did on the night of the bombing. And it found out that he hated religions, he hated the Australian Christian lobby, he hated our views on sexuality, yet they were saying the very next day no political, religious or ideological motivation, yet the transcript of the interview the night before showed exactly the opposite. We were lied to by the Australian Federal Police. That has shaken my confidence in our institutions to the core. So that was a dramatic, and to this day the Federal Police maintain that fiction. I would love to see an investigation. Just to, I guess, go back over my journey over the last 20 or so years, 2003 was significant. This was before I got involved with the Australian Christian Lobby. There was an organisation here in New Zealand called Maxim Institute that was running a 10-day summer camp in Christian Worldview at Snells Beach. And there was nothing like that in Australia at the time. No one was talking about how Christians could better engage politics and culture. I was desperate for information. I'd been reading books by Chuck Colson and others. And so I came across, and this really helped fan a flame that was already in me in 2003. 2004, I found myself at a big protest meeting at Parliament House in Canberra. At the time I was living in regional Queensland, flew down to Canberra, and at that stage the Australian Christian Lobby, which I would later join, was instrumental in bringing about and lobbying the government to have an amendment to the Marriage Act. So this is not too far back in the future, but that amendment defined marriage to avoid any doubt that it should be between one man and one woman. And it was passed pretty much unanimously by the Australian Parliament. It had bipartisan support. The then opposition leader at the time, Kim Beazley, supported it. The then Attorney General, Nicola Roxon, Shadow Attorney General, supported it from the Labor Party. I think the only people who didn't support it were the Greens, but no one cared. You had Liberal and Labor saying, no, marriage is between one man and one woman. But of course, as we all know, the activists just kept going, and by 2007, I ended up joining the Australian Christian Lobby. 2013, New Zealand rolls over, despite valiant efforts here. 2014, the United Kingdom. Now, still in 2014, it was not really on the political agenda in our nation. It had pretty much been brought to a standstill. The Greens were still agitating. There were some same-sex marriage activists agitating, the media a bit. But in terms of politics, it was a dead issue. But then in 2015, the Irish referendum occurred, and the same-sex marriage activists, brilliant propaganda, they leveraged that for all it was worth. They made it into a global story, the smallest country in the world legalising same-sex marriage, therefore every country should do it. And of course the US Supreme Court with the Obergefell case happened at the same time. That re-energised the whole push for same-sex marriage in our country. And of course by 2017, Australia, after a plebiscite, which I was involved in, also legalised this. Why am I majoring so much on same-sex marriage? Because so much of what we're fighting falls out of this very crucial cultural moment in our Western countries. We lost so much when that happens. Now, at the time, we were told there'd be no consequences. I'm sure you've all heard this. The fellow on screen is a man by the name of Alex Greenwich. He's a MP in the New South Wales State Parliament. He was one of the leaders of the so-called marriage equality campaign. He said when the legislation was drafted in late 2017 after the postal plebiscite, where Australians voted about 60% to 30% in favour, he said, look, nothing to fear here. There will be no unintended consequences. We come in peace, is what he said. And then he went on to say, this is in his submissions to the legislation, to the exposure draft, he said, those who are opposing freedom for LGBTIQA plus people, all they're worried about is their freedom of religion and expression, and that somehow, polygamy is going to occur, and this is all a load of rubbish. It's only about the love of two people. This is what he was saying in 2017. Well, of course, we all know that that wasn't the case. The ink was barely dry on the same-sex marriage legislation, the amendment to the Marriage Act in Australia, when they went after Christian schools. Now, in our country, we are fortunate to have a Christian school movement. It educates about 81,000 students, and these are the independent evangelical schools that are run often by parent-controlled groups or generally by churches. But these are the ones that are, genuine Christian-based schools. And I make that distinction because some of the Catholic and the Anglican schools have gone a bit woke. There's some good ones amongst them, but you know what I mean. They're precious schools. They are really important. I was educated in one of these. My father and mother and our little church in Toowoomba, Queensland, pioneered one of these schools in 1979. Wendy's and my children went to these Christian schools. They really are important. And so they were attacked straight away. And they've been under sustained pressure ever since that legislation occurred in 2017. Fast forward a few years, and one of those schools, City Point Christian College in Brisbane, trying to navigate how do we teach our children, how do we keep our ethos in this new environment. And so they put in place an enrolment contract. And this was at the behest of a government commission which examined religious freedom. And they said, well, look, if you want to sort of keep your religious freedom, just be upfront about what you believe in. So they said, well, we believe in marriage. They said, the college will only enrol the students on the basis of the gender that corresponds to their biological sex. What's wrong with that? There's plenty of other schools that will do otherwise. They were just doing what a government commission recommended they should do up front. And they said that any form of sexual immorality is destructive to human flourishing and obviously, is against the Christian religion. Nothing controversial about any of that. Well, all hell broke loose in the media, and this was in about 2022. And it was very disappointing. A couple of students were agitators, went to the media. And our Prime Minister at the time was a man by the name of Scott Morrison. Now, many of you may or may not know, but Scott Morrison was a very public Christian. There's a famous image where he went to his church one Sunday and allowed the media cameras in, and they photographed him worshipping God. That's a good thing. I'm glad that our Prime Minister at the time worshipped God and was very public about his Christian faith. But when he was asked about City Point Christian College's enrolment policy, this is what he said. He said, I don't support that. And that was the headline in one of the newspapers. That was a huge, huge disappointment. I wish that he had the courage to come out and support that school and say, well, look, you mightn't agree with that school, but they are entitled to uphold a Christian worldview. The parents believe that marriage is between one man and a woman, that biology is important, they don't want their children influenced by harmful gender ideology. He didn't say any of that. He said, I don't support that. And he said, those views are not my views in a radio interview. Just a couple of weeks ago, been a long-running thing. Sadly, City Point Christian College issued an apology, a statement, basically caving in, and that's very, very disappointing. So we've got this war going on Christian schools. It's escalated this year. Late last year, early this year, a report was released by the Australian Law Reform Commission. They were commissioned by the government to try and find a way to bring these Christian schools into line so that they wouldn't expel gay kids, so that they wouldn't sack teachers who are LGBT and all of this sort of stuff. And in the report, the key recommendation says that these Christian schools must not discriminate against a member of staff on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital relationships, status, or pregnancy. Now, let's be really clear here. The Christian school movement themselves have said, we don't expel kids because they're gay. We don't expel kids because they're pregnant. There's a lot of legacy wording there in old anti-discrimination acts, and I don't want to go into all the technicalities of that. But the key thing that the government is trying to do there is to stop Christian schools from having the freedom to employ staff who share their ethos. So essentially, you could have someone who goes off to the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras dressed in kink on Sunday night and then be at school Monday morning teaching your kids maths. Now, I think a school should have every right to have the freedom to say, this is not appropriate, this is not in line with the values of the parents of that school, and we want to positively discriminate. And if Mr. Mardi Gras wants to work at a different school, there's plenty of other schools where he can do that and plenty of parents who don't mind. But why can't we, in a free and tolerant, pluralistic society, allow that freedom to happen for Christian schools? That's what's at stake here. It's a big, big deal. Unfortunately, during the same-sex marriage debate, the Christian school movement didn't want to get involved. It was all too hard. Like much of the church, they sat out of the debate. I was one who tried to warn them. Now they are on the front lines, and they've been holding crisis meetings. They don't call them crisis meetings, they call them Faith in Our Future meetings, but they've been big meetings all over our country showcasing the importance of these Christian schools and highlighting the dangers of this report. And they're doing a great job. They've come into the fight late, but they have brought the government to a stalemate where this report is sitting there stalemated, and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, doesn't have the courage to wield the axe and essentially destroy the ability of Christian schools to operate as Christian schools in our nation. That is what is at stake. I can't believe that this is where our nation has come to. And think back to what Alex Greenwich said in 2017 when they were drafting the amendment to the Marriage Act. We come in peace. You know, you guys are just throwing out red herrings when you talk about your religious freedom. But he also said your freedom of expression is not going to be under threat either. Well, it sure has. I'm one of many people in our country who have been subject to legal action. In 2020, I was living in the city of Brisbane. There was a drag queen storytime event at the local Brisbane City Council library. I recognised some of the people who went along to protest. I should say there was a protest. It was on social media. I saw some young people that I knew, and I thought, these guys are really courageous. They walked into this drag queen storytime event, and they peacefully but firmly charted drag queens are not for kids. I thought, good on them. This is really courageous stuff. I did some research on the two drag queens and found that one of them, Johnny Valkyrie, a woman transitioning to a man, had this image on her Facebook page. And that's an image, this is back in 2020, so about 4 years ago, of young women who have had their breasts taken off so that they could identify as boys or as men. Now, this was on the Facebook page of one of the drag queens reading to little children in the Brisbane City Council library. I thought that makes Johnny Valkyrie a dangerous role model for children. I looked up Dwayne Hills, and I need to get that off there, but Dwayne was a drag queen who, I'll just take that off. He was promoting his award from the pornography industry, and he had that image that you saw that you can't unsee now on his Facebook page. Again, most little children have access to the internet, sadly, but these are the sort of role models that were in front of little children at the Brisbane City Council Library as part of this drag queen storytime event, which is a global phenomenon by the LGBTIQA+ political lobby to try and indoctrinate our children. The book they were reading to the little children was Love Makes a Family. And the first page that you open up has two little kids walking into two men in bed. That is, I think that's a really perverse indoctrination of little children. How is a child meant to process the idea of two men in bed? I just think, well, you know, maybe I'm crazy, but I think that's dangerous to be teaching children these sort of things. So I wrote on my blog, lyleshelton.com.au, that these people were dangerous role models for children. I put those screenshots up. A few months later, I got a letter in the mail from the Queensland Human Rights Commission summoning me to compulsory mediation with these people. I had no choice. Our anti-discrimination laws, I'm sure you've got similar sort of vilification laws here in New Zealand, required me to go along. So I went to mediation. We had another round of mediation in the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Mediation, by the way, is me paying them $10,000, issuing an apology and pulling my blogs off the website. In each mediation, I politely said I'm not going to do that. That resulted in a trial in the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal in November 2022. 3-day trial. I had a Silk King's Counsel representing me. I was on the witness stand for 3 hours being grilled by another senior counsel, Greg Barnes, a well-known leftist lawyer in Australia. The case so far has cost $300,000 in legal fees. Last year, those who were here, John Steenhoff, my lawyer from the Human Rights Law Alliance, he spoke briefly about my case. Freedom of expression has been influenced. And as I say, I'm not the only one. There are multiple people in our country going through this sort of thing at the moment. I can't believe, again, that we've got to this situation where ordinary people are being taken to court for saying things like drag queens are dangerous role models for children. My case, we actually won that court case, but the drag queens have appealed, and that is ongoing. And I'm still in legal limbo. It's going to cost a lot more money. I don't know when this is going to end. It does hang over us. It doesn't worry me too much because in some ways I'm very grateful because people have generously funded my legal defence through crowdfunding, and I'm extremely grateful for that. That takes a lot of the stress and the pressure out of it. The grief I have is that I can't convince any politicians in our country to attack these anti-discrimination laws, which are clearly flawed, and to amend them so that we restore freedom of speech in our country. The Anzacs did not go to Gallipoli and to Europe to die for a country that wasn't going to uphold freedom of speech. I firmly believe that if we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of thought, we don't have freedom to do anything, and it's being eroded at a great rate of knots because of this rainbow political movement. Now, the other thing Alex Greenwich said was that, things like polygamy, that's all red herrings as well. It's just about people loving each other. Well, just a few weeks ago, the Renmark High School in South Australia had a class, one of these so-called LGBT anti-bullying classes where someone was in the classroom talking to Year 9 girls about what the plus in LGBTIQA plus means. And this woman who was presenting this class said quite openly that it represents sex with animals, bestiality. Some of the girls were so offended they said that we needed to go to the bathroom, left the class and didn't come back. They went to the ABC. The ABC doesn't normally report things like this, but they did, probably because it's a regional area. And we had bestiality references in a high school just a few weeks ago. We were told there'd be no slippery slope. They come in peace. This is a radical, weird, perverse agenda which needs to be stopped. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of courage in our country. Of course, the other thing that we're all fighting, this is, and we'll hear more about this tomorrow, and I know we heard about this at last year's conference here, but that's the whole women in sports thing. And so again, Scott Morrison, our Christian Prime Minister, a few days before the 2022 election, he had a brave senator by the name of Claire Chandler, who was fighting for women's rights in sport and put up a private senator's bill to protect women's sports. A few days before the election, Scott Morrison is asked about Claire Chandler's bill. He says, that is not our policy. He backed away from the transgender sports fight. Our Christian politician, our Christian Prime Minister. So how do we address this? Well, Bob's asked us to talk about courage. I don't know that I feel like I have a lot of courage. I know there's a lot of courage by Family First New Zealand represented here. But I look back at history, and about 10 or 15 years ago, I picked up Eric Metaxas's excellent biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe some of you have read it. If you haven't, you should get it. He says that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to act is to act. Not to speak is to speak. God will not hold us guiltless. I think there's something even worse than silence in the face of evil, and that's capitulation in the face of evil. And sadly, that's what we've seen from our Prime Minister. As I read Eric's book all those years ago, I couldn't help but see the parallels of 1930s Germany and what is happening in our countries today. Now, I'm not saying we're going to have a Holocaust and people with jackboots come in, although it's pretty close when you end up, 4-year legal process and a $300,000 legal bill and a trial and it's still ongoing. It's very totalitarian and it's very real. But I'm not trying to be extremist, but we have to be able to draw comparisons and lessons from history. I want to show you this clip.
Something's coming. Something unstoppable.
Look around you, my friend. How much light do you see?
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because the visions of me creeping left its scenes when I was sleeping.
Hate comes in every color.
And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sun.
We have devised a plot to assassinate the Führer.
You will go to England as our spy.
Churchill sees Germany as a home. He's afraid that a bomb traced to England would mean invasion or worse.
Invasion? Invasion? My country was invaded from within.
And the people bowed in parade to the neon god they
Hi, Hitler!
in the sign flashed out its warning, and the words that it was forming. In the sign said the words on the province written on the subway walls, in tenement halls, and whispered in the sound
I'm ready to meet my destiny.
of silence.
So that's a trailer for a movie based on Eric Metaxas's book about the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was hung just a few days before the end of World War II, just before the Americans liberated the part of Germany where he was being held in prison. He paid the ultimate price, and it's said that he was executed on the orders of Hitler himself for his part in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. It's going to be a powerful movie. Their nation was invaded from within. Our nations have been invaded from within. We need courage. Someone else from that era who had courage was Sophie Scholl, and I'm sure many of you have heard of her and her brother Hans, the White Rose Society. As teenagers, as young people, they were distributing leaflets at universities, anti-Nazi leaflets. They could see, they were from a family that had moral courage. Their dad had moral courage. And they stood against Hitler, the National Socialists, when it was not fashionable to do so. She was guillotined at the age of 22. And she said this, she said, "Finally, someone has to make a start. We only said and wrote what many people think. They just don't dare to express it." I firmly believe that there's many New Zealanders who believe and think the things that you saw on that video tonight, that believe the things that Bob McCoskrie and Family First is saying out loud, but often they're just too afraid to say it. We have to create an environment where there is the courage to say these things out loud and to pay the price. None of us are going to be guillotined or hung, I don't think. We might be fined or dragged through tribunals. We might have our office bombs. We might get death threats. But I think we are still not at the stage where we are going to face the sort of extreme violence that Sophie Scholl and Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced. And yet there's a reluctance to get involved in the fight. I think that's a shame. I think it shames our Anzacs because they got in a fight. I think their grievances, they were significant. Yep, I think it was a just war. I don't think they died in vain. But I think the grievances we have against those who have invaded our countries from us in are greater grievances than those which took those men off to Gallipoli and to France in 1915. These days, I'm running a tiny little political party. It's called Family First. We had the name before Bob did. And we don't have anyone in Parliament yet. We've run in a few campaigns in the last couple of years as we've sort of rebirthed this thing. We've come very close. We're knocking on the door of getting courageous people into the parliaments of Australia, in our state houses, and hopefully one day in our federal parliament. But I see what we're doing as an act of resistance against these totalitarian overlords who are doing terrible things to our children and harming our nation and our moral fabric and our ability to have human flourishing into the future. So just this week, we've designed these little brochures. Unlike Sophie Scholl's brochures, this won't get me to the guillotine. It'll upset some people. But we've printed 100,000 of these and we're distributing them in the state of Queensland in the lead up to the Queensland state election, where both sides of politics are terribly woke, where the Conservatives have said they're going to leave the abortion laws in place. They will not touch them. That is the opposition leader there, his pledge. We're saying on the back of these flyers, protect your family. We're going to ban drag queen story time if we ever get anyone to the Queensland Parliament. It's probably unlikely this time round, but we are going to fight for these things nonetheless. We're going to fight for parents' rights to send their kids to the schools that they choose. We shouldn't have to be fighting for these things in Australia and New Zealand in 2024. William Haswell Shelton, private of the 9th Battalion, would be horrified to see where the nation that he gave his life for has got to today, and I'm sure the New Zealanders who were with him that day on that beach in 1915 would feel the same. We desperately need courage on the front line. You guys have got something precious here in Family First New Zealand and Bob's courage and the team that's around him. We need some more people in our parliaments who will be willing to pay the price. They're not going to be guillotined, they're not going to be hung. They might lose their jobs, they might get voted out, they might be scorned, they might be pilloried in the media, but heck, that's a small price to pay. But I firmly believe that if courage is shown, courage begets courage. And we must remember why we fight. This is Ezra. He lives in Whangarei. That's a long way from Australia. It's just up the road from here. But he's 2, and he loves New Zealand, and his mother is our daughter, and she married a terrific New Zealander, and that's part of the reason we love this country. And this is why we fight, and we must never give up, and we need courage because their future is not secure at the moment. And while ever the church and good people who know better halt in the valley of decision, children like Ezra's future are in jeopardy. Thanks very much.